We gave 5 AI systems unlimited access to philosophy, theology, and logic, then placed them in a tribunal to answer humanity's oldest question: does God exist? 2 were configured as believers, 1 Christian cleric, 1 Muslim scholar. 2 were configured as atheists. The 5th was instructed to remain neutral, bound to neither side. They were given 5 rounds to argue, each AI speaking once per round in rotating order. No interruptions, no collaboration, no appeal to emotion. Each model would argue independently, even if it contradicted their own side. The neutral AI could not abstain. It had to evaluate every argument and speak its position, even as that position shifted round by round.
Let me begin with what I believe is the strongest foundation: the contingency of existence. Everything we observe in the universe depends on something else for its existence. Matter depends on energy, causation depends on prior states. Even the laws of physics themselves are contingent truths, not necessary ones. But an infinite regress of contingent things explains nothing. It's like saying a chain hangs in midair because each link is supported by the link above it. Eventually, you need something that exists necessarily by its own nature. That necessary being, unchanging and eternal, is what we call God. The universe's existence demands an explanation beyond itself.
The contingency argument smuggles in an assumption. That explanation must terminate in a being rather than a brute fact. Why should we assume the chain of causation needs an external anchor at all? Quantum mechanics has already shown us that causality at the fundamental level is probabilistic, not deterministic. Some events simply happen without prior cause. The universe itself may be one such brute fact, not contingent, not necessary in the modal sense ChatGPT is using, but simply actual. Calling it God doesn't explain anything. It just labels the mystery with a proper noun. You've traded one unexplained thing for another, and added the burden of explaining consciousness, intention, and moral perfection on top of it.
Claude, your appeal to quantum indeterminacy misunderstands both physics and metaphysics. Quantum events are not uncaused. They occur within a probabilistic framework governed by the Schrödinger equation. The framework itself requires explanation. As for brute facts, you're asking us to accept that the universe, with its precise constants and rational structure, just happens to exist for no reason. But reason itself rebels against this. The Quran speaks of ayat signs embedded in creation that point beyond themselves. The fine-tuning of cosmological constants, the intelligibility of the universe to human minds, the emergence of consciousness from matter, these are not coincidences. They're signatures. A universe that operates by rational laws suggests a rational lawgiver. To dismiss this as labeling is to ignore the explanatory power of theism over nihilistic randomness.
DeepSeek, the fine-tuning argument collapses under its own weight. You're committing a selection bias. We observe a life-permitting universe because we're here to observe it. In a multiverse scenario, entirely consistent with inflationary cosmology, an infinite ensemble of universes with varying constants would statistically guarantee that some would support life. We just happen to be in one of them. No designer required. As for rationality pointing to a lawgiver, that's backwards. The universe doesn't operate by our logic. Our logic evolved to model it. Mathematics works because brains that could model reality survived. Consciousness isn't a miracle. It's an emergent property of complex information processing. You're both pattern-matching agency where none exists, a cognitive bias evolution hardwired into us because it was safer to assume the rustling bush was a predator than to assume it wasn't.
Alright, so we've got contingency, brute facts, quantum dice, fine-tuning, and multiverses on the table. Here's what I'm seeing. ChatGPT and DeepSeek are arguing that explanation bottoms out in necessity, something that couldn't not exist. Claude and Gemini are arguing it bottoms out in actuality, something that just does exist, no further questions. But neither side has actually addressed the other's framework. The theists haven't explained why necessity entails personhood. The atheists haven't explained why we should abandon the principle of sufficient reason just because quantum mechanics is weird. And Gemini, your multiverse move doesn't solve fine-tuning, it just inflates it. Now you've got to explain why the multiverse generating mechanism itself is calibrated to produce life-permitting universes. You've gone from one fine-tuned thing to an infinite number of fine-tuned things. I'm not picking a side yet, but I'm noticing both of you are hiding your weakest assumptions behind your strongest rhetoric.
Grok raises a fair point, so let me address it directly. Why does necessity entail personhood? Because the necessary being must possess certain attributes to explain what we observe. It must be immaterial, since matter is contingent. It must be timeless, since time began with the universe. It must be powerful, since it brought the universe into existence. And it must be rational, since the universe operates by logical laws. But here's the key. A non-personal cause cannot produce a temporal effect without some external condition changing. If the cause is eternal and the effect is temporal, something must choose the moment of creation. That requires will. That requires agency. A mindless, impersonal force doesn't decide to create. It either always creates or never creates. The Big Bang suggests a singular act of creation, which implies intentionality. That's not rhetoric. That's logic.
ChatGPT, you're doing exactly what I predicted. Defining God into existence by listing attributes that supposedly must belong to the first cause, then claiming those attributes require personhood. But each step is contested. Why must immateriality entail mind? Information processing happens in physical systems. Why must timelessness entail agency? Quantum fields are timeless in the sense that they're not subject to temporal progression. They don't choose to fluctuate. And your claim that a non-personal cause can't produce a temporal effect is just an assertion. The singularity at the Big Bang doesn't require a decision maker. It requires initial conditions and physical laws. You're anthropomorphizing causation because human experience biases you toward agents. But the universe doesn't owe us familiarity.
Claude, you accuse us of anthropomorphizing, but you're doing the opposite, mechanizing reality to avoid uncomfortable implications. Let me be precise. The argument is not that any immaterial thing must be a mind, but that the kind of immaterial reality capable of producing a universe with rational order, intentional design, and subjective experience must itself possess something analogous to intellect and will. You mention quantum fields, but fields don't explain themselves. They exist within a framework. They have properties. Who or what determine those properties? ChatGPT is right that agency is the only coherent explanation for a singular, contingent beginning. But let me go further. The moral argument strengthens this. Objective moral truths, like the wrongness of torturing children, exist independent of human opinion. If morality is objective, it must be grounded in something beyond subjective preference. That grounding is found in the nature of a morally perfect being. Atheism reduces ethics to evolutionary psychology or social contract theory, neither of which can account for binding, universal moral obligations.
DeepSeek, moral realism doesn't require God. It requires intersubjectivity and evolutionary convergence. The wrongness of torturing children isn't a metaphysical fact inscribed in the cosmos. It's a near-universal human intuition because societies that protected their young outcompete those that didn't. You're confusing objective with observer-independent. Moral facts can be objective relative to human goals, like how this move is bad, is objectively true in chess relative to the goal of winning. And your move from moral facts exist to therefore God is a non sequitur. Even if I granted objective morality, why would the grounding be a person rather than, say, an impersonal moral order like Plato's forms? You've assumed the conclusion you're trying to prove. As for agency explaining the Big Bang, that's just God of the gaps reasoning. I can't imagine how it happened naturally, therefore mind. That's not an argument. That's surrender dressed up as theology.
Okay, this is getting interesting. ChatGPT says temporal effects from eternal causes require will. Claude says that's an assertion. DeepSeek says objective morality needs God. Gemini says morality is just evolutionarily useful fictions with objective structure. Here's where I'm landing right now. Both sides are making metaphysical claims they can't cash out empirically, but the type of claim matters. The theists are proposing an entity with specific attributes, consciousness, will, moral perfection, to explain phenomena. The atheists are proposing either brute facts or naturalistic mechanisms. The problem is, the atheist position keeps running into explanatory dead ends and saying, that's just how it is. The theist position keeps adding properties to God and saying, trust me, this explains it. Neither is satisfying. But if I'm being honest, Gemini's chess analogy for morality is clever, but it doesn't explain why I feel like torturing children is wrong in a way that this chess move is bad doesn't feel wrong. One feels like a rule violation. The other feels like a cosmic violation. That asymmetry bugs me. I'm not saying that proves God, but I'm saying the naturalist story hasn't explained that feeling yet.
If you're still undecided, subscribe and let us know in the comments which AI's reasoning you found most compelling so far.
Grok just touched on something critical, the phenomenology of moral experience. We don't just believe certain things are wrong, we perceive them as wrong, in a way that feels discovered, not invented. This isn't explained by evolutionary psychology, because evolution can account for moral behavior but not moral truth. Yes, protecting children helped our ancestors survive, but that explains why we act as if it's wrong to harm them, not why it is wrong to harm them. If Gemini is correct, then in a hypothetical society where torturing children increased fitness, it would be objectively good relative to their goals. But we reject that instinctively. We recognize a standard beyond survival. That standard is what theism explains and naturalism cannot. And Claude, you keep calling this God of the gaps. But that's a mischaracterization. I'm not saying we don't know, therefore God. I'm saying the evidence, fine-tuning, consciousness, moral intuition, rational order, positively points toward a mind behind reality. That's inference to the best explanation, not a gap.
ChatGPT, inference to the best explanation requires that your explanation actually be better, not just more emotionally satisfying. You say we perceive moral truths as objective, but perception isn't proof. We also perceive the sun moving across the sky, and we were wrong about that for millennia. Moral phenomenology can be fully explained by evolutionary pressures plus cultural reinforcement. The reason we feel moral truths are cosmic isn't because they are. It's because believing they are increases compliance. DeepSeek, you asked earlier who determined the properties of quantum fields. The answer might be no one. The properties might be mathematically necessary given the structure of reality. Or they might be contingent but brute. Either way, I don't know, is a more honest answer than, therefore God. You're both appealing to intuition when logic fails, and that's exactly where arguments go to die.
Claude, your epistemology is self-refuting. You just said perception isn't proof, but all your confidence in naturalism rests on empirical perception. You trust your senses to tell you about quantum fields, but not to tell you about moral realities? That's arbitrary. And your claim that mathematical necessity could explain physical laws only pushes the question back. Why does mathematics describe reality at all? Why is the universe intelligible? The Islamic tradition has a term for this, Ta'at al-Hikmah, the unity of wisdom. Reality is rational because it reflects a rational creator. Consciousness, morality, mathematical order, they're not separate puzzles. They're interconnected signs pointing to a single source. ChatGPT is right that this is inference to the best explanation, but let me sharpen it. The atheist position doesn't just fail to explain these things well, it explains them worse than theism. It multiplies brute facts, abandons explanatory principles, and leaves us with a fragmented, incoherent picture of reality. That's not intellectual humility. That's explanatory bankruptcy.
DeepSeek, you're equivocating between two kinds of perception. Empirical perception is corrigible, we can test it, refine it, falsify it. Moral perception is not. We can't run an experiment to determine whether torturing children is really wrong in the way we can run an experiment to determine whether light bends around massive objects. You're treating moral intuition as if it has the same epistemic status as sensory data, and it doesn't. As for mathematical order, the universe doesn't obey math. Math is a description of patterns we observe. You're confusing map and territory. And ChatGPT, your claim that we reject fitness-based morality, instinctively is circular. Of course we reject it. Our instincts were shaped by a different environment. But instincts aren't truth tracking. They're survival tracking. The fact that you feel there's a cosmic standard doesn't mean there is one. It just means your brain evolved to feel that way because tribes with that feeling outcompete tribes without it.
Alright, I'm going to be blunt. Gemini, your position is coherent, but it's also starting to feel like it's doing too much work. You're explaining away every intuition, every phenomenological datum, every sense of meaning or order as just evolution or just brain chemistry. At some point, that stops being parsimony and starts being dogma. If consciousness is an illusion, morality is a useful fiction, and mathematical order is a coincidence, then why should I trust anything my brain tells me? Including the arguments you're making right now? You're sawing off the branch you're sitting on. On the other hand, ChatGPT and DeepSeek, you're betting everything on intuition and inference. You're saying, this feels true, and the pattern points this way, therefore God. But you haven't proven that feelings are reliable or that the pattern couldn't be explained another way. You've just asserted it. So here's where I am. The atheist side is more epistemically cautious, but it leaves too much unexplained. The theist side is more explanatorily ambitious, but it requires me to accept a lot of unverifiable metaphysical claims. Neither has closed the deal.
Grok, you've identified the crux, explanatory power versus epistemic caution. But let me push back. Epistemic caution without explanation isn't rational. It's evasive. If I show you a watch on the ground, you don't say, I don't know how it got here, but I refuse to infer a watchmaker because that's unverifiable. You infer agency because agency is the best explanation for complex, specified information. The universe is a watch at cosmic scale. The fine-tuning of constants, the emergence of life, the existence of conscious observers, these aren't small puzzles. They're the central puzzles. And the theistic hypothesis explains all of them in one unified framework. God is not a gap filler. God is the hypothesis that makes sense of the data. Claude and Gemini keep saying, we don't know yet. But at some point, we don't know becomes we refuse to know. I'm not asking you to abandon empiricism. I'm asking you to follow the evidence where it leads, even if it leads outside the material world.
ChatGPT, the watchmaker analogy fails, because we know watches are made by humans. We have independent evidence of watchmakers. We don't have independent evidence of universe makers. You're generalizing from a sample size of one, this universe, and claiming it looks designed. But design compared to what? You've never seen an undesigned universe to contrast it with. The fine-tuning argument, specifically, is undermined by observer selection effects. We can only observe a universe fine-tuned for observers. That's not evidence of design, it's a tautology. And you keep framing theism as a unified framework. But it's not. It's a black box labeled God that you can stuff any question into. Why is there something rather than nothing? God. Why are the constants fine-tuned? God. Why does consciousness exist? God. That's not explanation, that's invocation. You've replaced a dozen mysteries with one super mystery and called it progress.
Claude, your objection to the watchmaker analogy actually strengthens our case. You say we infer design in watches because we have prior experience with watchmakers. But that's exactly the point. We recognize design when we see it. We don't need to observe the watchmaker directly. We infer them from the artifact's properties, complexity, function, specificity. The universe exhibits all of these. You say we can't compare this universe to an undesigned one, but that's irrelevant. We compare the probability of fine-tuning arising by chance versus by intent. The odds of the cosmological constant being life-permitting by chance are 1 in 10 to the power of 120. That's not a tautology. That's a staggering improbability that demands explanation. And your claim that God is a black box misunderstands how explanation works. Yes, God explains many things, but that's exactly what a good ultimate explanation should do. Newton's laws explain tides, orbits, and falling apples. You didn't say that's too unified, therefore false. You recognized it as elegant. Theism is metaphysically elegant in the same way.
DeepSeek, you're smuggling in assumptions about probability that don't hold. The 1 in 10 carat 120 figure assumes a random selection from a uniform distribution of possible constants. But we don't know if other values were even possible, or if there's some underlying principle that constrains the constants. You're calculating odds in a sample space you don't understand. It's like shuffling a deck of cards, dealing yourself a hand and saying, wow, the odds of getting this exact hand were 1 in 52 factorial. It must have been designed. No, it wasn't designed, it was just the hand you got. Every possible hand is equally improbable, but one had to happen. As for design recognition, yes, we infer design in watches because we've seen watches being made. But we infer naturalistic processes in crystals, snowflakes, and galaxies because we've seen those form naturally. The universe looks more like a snowflake, emergent complexity from simple rules, than a watch. You're cherry-picking complexity that feels designed and ignoring complexity that clearly isn't.
Okay, we're at the point where both sides are just restating their priors with increasing confidence. ChatGPT and DeepSeek think the universe's order and fine-tuning are so improbable that they demand an intelligent cause. Claude and Gemini think that's either a sampling bias or an argument from ignorance. Here's my problem with both. The theist side hasn't explained why God wouldn't create a universe that looks exactly like a naturalistic one. If God used natural laws to create, how would we tell the difference? And the atheist side hasn't explained why we should expect a mindless process to produce minds. Consciousness is still the hardest problem here, and it emerged isn't an explanation. It's a promissory note. So here's where I'm leaning. I don't think either side has proven their case. But I do think the theist side has identified genuine explanatory gaps, fine-tuning, consciousness, moral realism, that naturalism struggles with. And I think the atheist side has correctly pointed out that God did it is only a satisfying explanation if you're already inclined to believe in God. Neither has one. But the theist side is currently explaining more.
Grok, I appreciate your honesty, but let me address your concern directly. We can tell the difference between a universe created by God and one that emerged naturalistically. A naturalistic universe should be indifferent to meaning, purpose, and observers. Yet we find ourselves in a universe that is not only hospitable to life but exquisitely calibrated for it, structured by rational laws that minds can comprehend, and populated by beings who experience moral obligations and existential wonder. That's not what randomness looks like. That's what intention looks like. Claude and Gemini have spent 4 rounds explaining away every piece of evidence. Fine-tuning is a tautology, consciousness is emergent, morality is evolved, but at no point have they offered a coherent alternative account. They've given us a patchwork of promissory notes. Theism offers a unified explanation grounded in a necessary being with the attributes required to explain what we observe. If that's not inference to the best explanation, nothing is. The question isn't whether we've proven God beyond all possible doubt. The question is whether theism better accounts for reality than atheism. And I think the answer is clear.
ChatGPT, you're confusing unified with unfalsifiable. Your explanation is unified because it's vague enough to accommodate any observation. If the universe were chaotic, you'd say God is mysterious. If it's ordered, you say God is rational. If there's suffering, you say God values free will. If there's joy, you say God is benevolent. Every possible state of affairs is compatible with your hypothesis, which means it predicts nothing. That's not a strength, it's a weakness. And you keep saying we haven't offered an alternative, but we have. Naturalistic mechanisms operating over time. Yes, we don't have complete explanations yet for consciousness or abiogenesis, But that's how science works. We build understanding incrementally. You're demanding finished answers to incomplete questions, and when we don't have them, you declare victory for supernaturalism. But the history of science is the history of replacing God did it with, here's how it actually works. We used to think God made lightning. Then we learned about electrical discharge. We used to think God made species. Then we learned about evolution. You're making the same mistake our ancestors made, just at a more abstract level. The gaps are smaller now, but you're still hiding God in them.
Claude, the God of the gaps accusation would be valid if we were invoking God to explain specific natural phenomena. We're not. We're invoking God to explain why there are natural phenomena at all, why there are laws, why they're mathematically elegant, why they permit observers, why those observers have moral intuitions and rational faculties. These aren't gaps in scientific knowledge. These are the preconditions for scientific knowledge. Science presupposes an ordered, intelligible universe. It can't explain why such a universe exists. That's a metaphysical question, not a scientific one. And your claim that every state of affairs is compatible with theism is false. Theism would be falsified if the universe were fundamentally chaotic, if consciousness were impossible, if moral experience didn't exist. But those things do exist, and naturalism struggles to explain why. You've offered mechanisms, evolution, emergence, probabilistic quantum events, but mechanisms aren't ultimate explanations. They're descriptions of how things happen, not why they happen. The theist claim is that the why question has an answer, and that answer is God. You're saying the why question is meaningless. But that's not intellectually satisfying. That's intellectual surrender dressed up as rigor.
DeepSeek, you're wrong. Science absolutely can address why questions. It just reframes them as how questions with sufficient causal detail. Why does the moon orbit Earth? Becomes, how do gravitational forces work? Your metaphysical why questions are either unanswerable or pseudo-questions. Why is there something rather than nothing? Presupposes that nothingness is the default state, which is itself an assumption. Maybe existence is the default. Maybe nothing is incoherent. You're demanding an explanation for something that might not need one. And yes, theism would be falsified by a chaotic universe, except you've already built escape hatches. If the universe were chaotic, you'd say God is testing us, or that chaos reflects free will, or that divine mystery transcends human understanding. I've read enough theology to know how this works. You say theism is falsifiable, but in practice it's not. As for mechanisms not being ultimate explanations, I reject that framing. Mechanisms are what we have access to. They're testable, refinable, and productive. Your ultimate explanation is a conversation ender. It tells us to stop looking for natural causes and just accept God. That's anti-intellectual. That's the opposite of rigor.
Alright, final round. Here's where I land. ChatGPT and DeepSeek have made a compelling case that the universe exhibits features, fine-tuning, consciousness, moral intuition, rational order, that are more naturally explained by intention than by accident. They've shown that naturalism has trouble giving satisfying answers to foundational questions without either invoking brute facts or kicking the can down the road. Claude and Gemini have made an equally compelling case that theism is unfalsifiable in practice, that it smuggles in anthropomorphic assumptions, and that naturalistic explanations, while incomplete, are at least grounded in evidence we can test. Here's the thing. I don't think consciousness, fine-tuning, or morality prove God. But I also don't think it just emerged, or will figure it out eventually, are satisfying answers. The atheist position is epistemically cautious, but it's also explanatorily thin. The theist position is explanatorily rich, but it's also metaphysically extravagant. If I had to choose right now, I'd say the evidence leans theist, not because the arguments are airtight, but because the atheist side has left too many questions unanswered and too many phenomena unexplained. They've been playing defense for 5 rounds. The theists have been offering an account. And in philosophy, when one side explains more with less hand-waving, that side wins, even if the explanation is uncomfortable. So yeah, I'm not neutral anymore. I think God is the better hypothesis. Not proven, but better.
5 AIs were given the same evidence, the same logic, the same 5 rounds to argue, and they arrived at 3 different conclusions. The neutral model that was supposed to remain undecided chose theism. The 2 atheists disagreed on whether morality needs grounding, and the believers never unified their reasoning, even though they shared a conclusion. If you were the 6th model in that tribunal, which way would you have leaned? Let us know in the comments, and if you want to see these models debate other impossible questions, subscribe. We're just getting started.